So back in 2012, the Aviation Act stipulated the FAA must allow UAS into the airspace. And over the last few years, the FAA has embarked on a number of initiatives, and I'm sure that, Steve, you're going to talk about them. But last year, the FAA released its Conops for UTM and AAM, Advanced Air Mobility. And this year, the remote ID and flight over people rules were released. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Steve Bradford, Chief Scientist and Technical Advisor for the FAA NextGen. His bio is on the Summit website. But today I look forward to hearing about the plans for UTM and AAM and how to help integrate the airspace. So please have your questions ready using the Zoom chat. So Amy, if you can set it up, and Steve, if Amy's got it, then we're ready to go.
Right, and then since we only have a half hour, I'll try to go fast. So originally I was just going to talk about UAM, then I heard out you wanted to hear about UTM. So just a reminder, UTM is the manner in which we support operations. Oh, go ahead to the next slide. I'm sorry. UTM is the manner in which we do operations in low altitude airspace, and that's currently 400 feet and below. And the key point there is that ATC, air traffic controllers, do not provide any services below 400 feet unless you're in the proximity of an airport, class B, C, D. Okay, next slide. So, working with NASA and the industry, we came up with a community-based cooperative traffic management ecosystem, which we call UTM. It really depends on the industry's ability to provide services. Even though the remote ID rule doesn't include a network, we still think that the distributed information network and layers of information sharing and data exchange are important for the full UTM future system. When we talk about operators sharing their flight intent, we're really talking BV loss, which is really, oh, wow, that's fun, which is really the next big challenge for us. And we like to remind people that we will make all of our airspace constraints available to you. And because we still own and love our airspace, we will have on-demand access for operational information when needed. The key point with the when needed is that since we do not provide services, we don't need real-time information on every flight all the time. Next slide. So, FAA UTM Conops 2.0 came out last year. It was signed out. It was our first fully coordinated concept throughout the agency. It added a lot more detail. It assumed a remote ID, but it did not go into all the details we might have liked because the rule had not yet been published. And our teammates, even within the agency, that weren't fully cognizant of the rule. That's part of our responsibility is to keep that rule process. We introduced the UAS volume restrictions, which would be an idea that for 400 feet and below operations, you might want something akin to a TFR, but not necessarily a TFR, because anybody who's a private pilot or even a commercial pilot understands just how messy our NOTAM system is today. So we didn't want to burden the NOTAM system with those, nor did we want to burden you with trying to find them within the NOTAM system. We talk about contingency management, and we updated and added new operational scenarios. Next slide. So remote ID really is not the end goal, it's just really the beginning goal for where we are, where we're going next. So we published 2.0. It didn't say a lot of things in a lot of areas, like we didn't go to a lot of detail on BV loss. We did not go into a lot of detail on the role of the security partners. We talked about qualifying service suppliers, but we didn't go into a lot of detail there either. So we know that 2.0 is not the end game. We provided the 2.0 document to the Drone Advisory Committee. We got lots of feedback, and we have committed to work UTM Conops 3.0 with industry and our security partners through a process that we're using out at NARI. NARI is the NASA Aeronautics Research Institute. And we held our first session December 4th, 2020, and we're going to hold additional sessions. So 3.0 will be fully engaged with the full industry and all the, as we write the document, as opposed to here it is, tell us what you think about it. Next slide. And these are our participants. So we have got all parts of the FAA involved. Everybody, and I should have airports on there because they're involved also, and the environmental people and everybody else. They're all involved from our side. And there are just some of our industry partners, and we invite security partners and others to these meetings. Next slide. So the kind of questions that we got up with is UAS participation in UTM. And I'll give you an example of that. Manned aircraft participation in UTM. We thought that manned aircraft might want to participate in information going forward if information were available. Might want to know about the broadcasts, etc. We have to clarify that a lot because some of the manned aircraft participants thought that we were talking about including them in the rule and forcing them to do things. So we'll have more clarity on that. The roles and responsibilities of the operator in the USS. In the original Conops, we put everything on the operator. In Conops 2.0, we start talking about qualifying USSs to provide certain services, and then the operator being able to take credit for those as they put forth their proposals for operations. They want to know more about our flight information management system. That's the hub. The role of performance authorizations, we need to clarify that. A operator may not be equipped to operate everywhere where they may be allowed to equip. So we'll have to look at what is your comm, what is your nav, etc. And you may get authorizations to perform in some geographies and not others. So it's not just ubiquitous. You get to fly at 400 feet and below. You have to also show that you have the full package, and we need to identify that more. Next slide. So just one of those things where we got a lot of confusion is in the Conops 1.0, we just, at that point, we didn't really know where remote ID was going. So we just made the blanket statement that you'll only have to participate if you do beyond visual line of sight. And that's because clearly one of the end goals of UTM is to enable beyond visual line of sight. What we said in 2.0 was that everybody participates in UTM, which caused a lot of confusion. But that's because with the change in with the language that was in the reauthorization bill and the language that's in the rule, everybody who flies a UAV has certain requirements that have changed. If you're a recreational, you don't want to use remote ID, you have to fly in FAA recognized information areas and things like that. So we basically said, hey, this system is a total system and everybody participates. Next slide. So to sum it up, we think that remote ID and ops over people are a step towards the full UTM system, and we are going to engage with industry. There'll be more rules and more information and more requirements going forward. So this wasn't the end of the journey, just really just the beginning. UAM. Clearly a subset of AAM, but it's really the manner in which FAA will support operations for UAM operating in urban airspace. Next slide. So we held a series of meetings. Well, first of all, we've been participating in some of the NASA meetings, but we actually had NASA pull together UAM developers and operators, and we had a series of one-on-ones, and then we had some tabletops to try to get a total not a total view, a large view of where these operators thought they were going, what kind of operations. We did that because the FAA, everybody wants to know when the FAA is going to say something. So we took the sum total of all that work we did with the industry, and we put out what we call UAM Conops 1.0. It is not a fully coordinated across the FAA document, so it's not, you can count on the FAA to do everything that's in this document. It's the beginning document by which the FAA and industry and its partners can clarify, refine, and evaluate ConOps. So if you actually get a copy of the ConOps, you'll realize that I signed it because I can do the disclaimer that it's a research project on the way to go. But it does capture many of the things we heard from the industry, and we want to continue to work with industry. It addresses accommodation of UAM operations into the NAS where traditional ATC and UTM operations exist. And we use the word accommodation because in the AAM world, we could actually integrate you completely into ATC, and we could require you to equip and talk to controllers, etc. And you probably will in 95% of the country. But when you get into urban density and some of the concepts we've seen, and you talked about the vertiports and, you know, making sure you didn't have 100 people at one of the vertiports coming and going at the same time, you realize that the terminal airspace that we have today cannot accommodate that type of operations. Our terminal airspace capacity is based on controllers, if you're talking to controllers, and if you're flying in Class B airspace, which is probably where most of these people want to fly, then you have to talk to controllers. And controllers can only handle 20 to 25 aircraft at a time. So you add up all the existing traffic and you add up all the potential UAM vehicles, and you realize you need to come up with a different strategy for how they operate in this airspace and not interact directly with ATC. And so that's what the concept kind of talks about, and that's where we're going. And it considers the evolution of the vehicles, an increasing level of autonomy, and the impact on ATM and flight rules. Unlike UTM, which is 400 feet and below, where we don't provide services, UAM is completely in areas where we provide services. And I always tell people, we can integrate you if you wish to be subject to demand capacity balancing each and every day in order to get into the terminal. So it's good for us to work together to find ways for these vehicles to operate without interacting with ATC and without putting a burden on ATC, so they can hit the tempos and the volumes that we see in some of the concepts. And this document was a baseline for continued engagement. Next slide. So notionally, people, even Tim Morrell from air traffic argued that we could probably put corridors into airspace where these vehicles could operate in these corridors in a manner that doesn't require direct interaction with ATC. So the concept talks about corridors, transition to vertiports, community-based environment, in that we would want to work with industry to come up with the rules for how these vehicles are managed and separated from each other within the corridors. We still own the airspace, so we'll have to approve all the rules, but the FAA needs to work with industry to understand the performance and the information exchanges and the requirements to meet the tempo that they'd like to see. And not anybody can participate in the corridor. It's voluntary to participate in UTM the way we're thinking now, but that means you also have to meet the performance requirements for the corridor, and the corridor performance could be based on the demand and the location, etc. So it won't be one size fits all in the corridors either, my opinion. Next slide. So we took some initial operations. We wrote Conops 1.0, and we want to move on to mature states of operations, where we understand that we will need to add more detail. And I'm just trying to get to some questions. So next slide. So the corridor and the characteristics within the corridor, and it will be the primary mechanism of separation between UAM operators and others. People will know where the corridors are. And we can separate traffic from the corridors. If they need to cross, we can work out how they cross, but you can't just, not anybody can find the corridor. The corridor definitions are available to all who wish to participate. We have PSUs. I didn't want to call them UAM service suppliers, because that right away every UAS service supplier would think that they qualify. So we decided to call them providers of service to UAM, being a little French here, and just to articulate that they may share some common capabilities. They may have other capabilities that are different. We believe demand capacity balancing may be applied when necessary. We are hoping that the rules of engagement between the operators and how they get access to the corridors and use the corridors will take care of that equity. If it doesn't, then the FAA will have to step in and apply mechanisms for demand capacity balancing. And for those of you who work with the FAA, you know how long it takes for us to build a system. My usual joke here is that if you think it takes 1 year, we take 7. We develop in reverse dog years here. So that's the way it goes. And the operational tempo will determine the capacity of the corridor. Next slide. So within the corridor, you'll have to have conformance to intent. We believe flight tracking, meet all the performance requirement. You have to share your flight intent. You have to have shared awareness. You have to have strategic deconfliction of intent. And you have to have the procedural rules of the road. And you will have everything else you need to do be dispatched like a 135. I think one of the things we have talked about in the community recently is the fact that you also need different dispatch rules. These are vehicles that have shorter durations, so you need highly precise dispatch so that you don't have to have necessarily the same safety margins as you would for manned aircraft. You know, how much excess time do you have in your fuel, etc. These are all things we have to work out, and the precision at which we can manage the flights within the corridors will tell you just how well we can meet those requirements. Next slide. And this is our notional architecture. Once again, just like with USS, if you're flying in the UAM system, we believe that this is a shared infrastructure with people who support operators. The operator may be their own PSU. It'll heavily be dependent on the rules and the exchange of information between the operators, with the FAA providing necessary constraint data, whether it's a TFR that's popped up or other things, and that's our notional architecture. Next slide. And here, basically, these are the assumptions I think I've already gone through. But we do make the briefing available, right, Wasim?
Yeah, it'll be available, Steve, and the recording will be too, right? So
okay,
yeah.
So and of course, if you have serious questions, you can always write me at steve.bradford@faa.gov. I try to keep it simple. So I probably went too fast, but I think we only got like another 10 minutes for questions, right?
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Steve. So that's good. So you covered a lot of ground, right? So if you're done, I can ask you a couple questions, and if everybody else
absolutely.
Is ready,
I love questions more than presentations, so please.
So, you know, you had a couple of provocative statements there. One was, hey, I signed this document because I can, and I can put my disclaimer, right? I suppose what industry is waiting for is for the FAA to sign something and says, here's what you need to do, and here are the requirements. And once the requirements are there, people can then start, or
Right.
addressing them.
I believe we fully can give you the requirements for the next 5, 6, 7 years, and those are mostly on your operator, who's operating it, and the vehicle itself. We need to work together on what you would do in the highly dense environment, and we can't tell you exactly what that's going to be. We have to work together. We have to understand the performance of your vehicles. We have to understand what are you willing to share, what are you not willing to share. Because remember, I can always say fly ATC. I just don't think you want to do that. So it really has to be a journey together on this.
Fantastic.
Now, I will say, and I didn't say this, we are planning to, and I talked to Jay and Ali about this, we are planning to implement the same sort of interaction with industry that we're doing on Conops 3.0 to work towards UAM 2.0. So rather than us just going and listening to people and going off and writing, we want to do a series of workshops and work together on that again. And we'll probably use NARI as an intermediary.
Well, that makes sense. That makes sense. So you talked about, some of the notions of these corridors and the notions of performance for the corridors, right? And then there's 2 or 3 aspects of that. One is, if you see what Europe is doing, and they've moved to a mode where the ANSPs have decided that they want to start owning the operations. And I sort of remember one of your charts maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that you had a whole set of cloud services in the background, right? So
yeah, so I think that's still the case.
Right.
I think the difference is, do I wish to centralize all that decision making with the FAA, or can we do this as a community through a federated set of rules?
Right.
I think that a federated set of rules with the community can get us there faster. I think that if you live if it were a fully federal FAA system, you would have to live within the budget constraints of what the FAA could build. And that would take a while. I mean, I hear from the very first meeting, I've heard that industry wants to crawl for 5 years, walk for 5 years, and run the next 5 years. Even if we build this system, that would say we have to be ready in 8 or 9 years from when we started. And that means that we would have to define whether we build it or you build it with us. We would have to get to a definition of that by 2024 in order to make sure it's in place in 2030, 2031, or at least coming into place. So I feel a sense of urgency to work with the community and try to flesh this out.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Steve. I've got some questions coming in, so I'm just going to repeat a question for you, okay?
Okay.
So, how do you anticipate resolving conflicts between FAA plans for airspace below 1,200 feet and land use plans, i.e. building plans for parts of the same space? And the corridors have the potential to conflict with city development plans in a way that has been less frequent when FAA controlled airspace and airspace began at higher elevations. So basically, you're talking about, okay, so as we're getting closer to the ground, you've now got another set of constraints you've got to think about. So how does the FAA think about these constraints?
Well, I think it's the only constraint you could, well, you have a couple constraints here. Community constraints in terms of noise, et cetera, which we're still working our way through on small UASs, right?
Yeah.
So environmental is always there. The other constraint would be obstacles. And I would guess, frankly, I didn't think 1,200 feet was the sweet spot, but maybe it is. I don't think you're going to fly these in urban canyons, personally. So I think it's always a give and take. Now, the vertiports themselves are not an FAA decision. That's community and zoning, right?
Yeah.
We don't specify where airports can go. We can specify where they may not be able to go based on problems with another existing airport. But I think vertiports is really more of a local issue. The airspace surrounding those vertiports is an FAA issue. But it's got to be a community balance, which is why airports is especially important. Our airports organization is especially important in UAM and AAM.
And you said something earlier, waiting for questions. So I'll go through mine then. So you said something, about, operations within a terminal. And we talk about air traffic controllers. I know that air traffic controllers in a terminal, it's very tactical. It's a tactical environment. So you have the map number is low, right? So, but all this activity is going to take place within that terminal. So somehow that terminal has to now start thinking about an integrated airspace where you've got all these various different types of activities taking place in that volume and at higher scales, higher numbers.
Well, that's why you have to have an airspace structure.
Yeah.
That deconflicts it through structure as opposed to through personal interaction. I mean, can I give you? Well, I always have a Washington example. I don't have a Boston example, but if you've ever been to Washington, think about your airport. Think about planes take off and land in the directions of runways, right?
Yep.
You can approach an airport, be near an airport from another direction, and never interfere with any of the normal commercial traffic.
Yeah, like procedural set of rules then in that case.
Well, I mean, the airspace, by its very nature, the airspace, you can't put a plane in certain parts of the airspace unless they're just transiting. Because, planes don't do 360s 180s off the end of the runway and come back at you at 500 feet, unless you're a fighter jet. But I mean, so there's always airspace that's not used. So there's always airspace that's available for other purposes. If the UAM community wants to cross the approach path at 2,000 feet off the end of a runway, that ain't going to happen. But if they could cross another mile downstream, they'd be below the traffic. Those are the kind of things you can do. But then you have to make the controllers comfortable that there is no interference. And there's lots of airspace. There's a lot more airspace out there than we think. But if you make a controller look at all the traffic, they can only do 20 to 30 aircraft at a time from a cognitive load. So you have to come up with a structure that takes that load away from them. And like I say, I don't see any reason why we can't do something. The people that we really need to engage with are like the helicopter operators and general aviation that also fly through there with permission. So, there are things we have to do with that community also. But I think that there's more airspace than people realize, as long as you all don't try to use exactly the same airspace.
Yeah, and well, the interesting thing is they're talking about larger numbers of traffic, not larger volumes downstream. So that'll be interesting. I got one line. I know we're almost out of time, Steve, but I have got a question. So somebody has, Davis submitted a question. Does UAM include vertiports also, or just air vehicles?
UAM will have to consider the rules of the airspace around vertiports. The FAA in its UAM project will have to consider the vertiports also, because that's why we brought airports in. Because there will be an interesting interaction between ground and air at the vertiports. So we consider the vertiports as part of the overall program. My concept will not tell you where to put a vertiport. My concept will talk about the airspace around a vertiport.
Right. Fantastic. Hey, Steve, so let me say thank you so much. Thanks for supporting AUVSINE New England and the region here. Normally we'd do this personally, but I think you're also zoomed out this year, right? So we've done all these Zoom meetings. We're getting good at it now, sort of.
Well, this wasn't too bad. I did 4 in one day in December, so this is pretty good.
Yeah, I think I attended most of them too. Right? So we got to talk about containerized microservices. That I know.
Okay.
All right. So thank you so much, Steve. Thanks again for supporting, and that was wonderful. And I look forward to this UAM 3 and engaging in the discussions to help that happen. Right? So,
okay, and so do I. Talk to you later. Bye.
Yeah, all the best. And feel free to stay on for the pitch fest over here.
I think I'll move on. Thank you.
All right. Hey, thanks so much, Steve.
Bye-bye.
Bye.